Fathers, daughters, and we just added sons, and the issue of kingship in King Lear and King Samuel. I guess I'll start. King Lear, Shakespeare's King Lear, which was first performed in 1605 to 6, is arguably Shakespeare's darkest and deepest play. It's bitter. His reason for writing might have been that he was contemplating his own retirement or the retirement of others. He's far away in his own life at this point from his retirement, but he was a man who thought ahead. It's loosely based on a contemporary lawsuit, a lawsuit that's contemporary to Shakespeare, concerning a man named Mr. Annesley, whose daughters committed him to an insane asylum and so that they could have control of his fortune. They, by law, should have allotted him a portion to live on. They did not, and he sued them for it because although he was a little bit senile, he wasn't that far gone. And one of his daughters was named Cordell. If you remember the play King Lear, one of the characters is Cordelia, and I'll get to that later. The secondary plot of this was loosely based on a romance by Sir Philip Sidney, who was an approximate contemporary of Shakespeare. Shakespeare lived from 1564 to 1616, and Sidney lived from 1554 to 1586, so they knew what each other was writing. The play serves as a metaphor for what happens when misguided motivations result in misguided choices, and when the natural bounds of parenthood and friendship are sundered, and the logical establishment of royal succession is violated. Although it is the most tragic of Shakespeare's plays, King Lear does offer hope at the end, although it's fleeting and specious, that sanity, justice, stability, and love can prevail. There's also a major focus on identity, and it concerns the question of does who you are affect or equal what you are. And in the play, Lear's most poignant cry to heaven is, who is it that can tell me who I am?
So when Mrs. Goldberg came to me and proposed this, so first of all, I thought I had died and gone to heaven. The big joke around here is that the Tanakh teachers want to teach English and the English teachers want to teach Tanakh. So we're doing it together. So we're doing it together. And we started talking, and the book of Samuel, particularly the first book of Samuel, is an incredibly rich, I feel, an incredibly rich source for any author, dramatist. Shakespeare knew his Bible. There's no question about that. And there are a lot of themes in the book of Samuel that are very relevant to stories that have to do with kingship, whether it's Hamlet or Lear. In particularly, the book of Samuel revolves around three main characters: the prophet Samuel, the King Saul, and the future King David, and then the secondary character of that trio is Saul's son, David. And there is...
Jonathan,
thank you. I guess I haven't had enough coffee yet this morning. Okay, only one cup. Yeah, Jonathan. And similar to King Lear, what the book really explores in depth is the relationship between parents and children. We find out that Saul has two daughters, the relationship between Saul and his son Jonathan, between his adopted son and their eventual son-in-law David. And really what it explores is also this idea of identity, is how much are you your job, and how much is your job a product of you? In other words, how we really see Saul kind of trapped between being a really incredibly good, decent, holy person, and then becoming a person in power, and what that does to him. And then we also see that the pull between the professional and the personal, in David, that is much more explored later in Samuel 2, which was incidentally not written by Samuel because Samuel was dead at that point. But also the role of Samuel as a prophet as opposed to Samuel as a father. So a lot of these questions of identities and relationships that are explored in Lear are also explored in the book of Samuel.
Okay, for those of you who haven't read Lear at all or lately, I thought I'd go through what it was about. Lear is, the overall concept is essentially civil war, its causes, its resulting chaos, and its eventual resolution. Lear is the story of a medieval king of Britain. His name is Lear, and he has 3 daughters. And at the end of his reign, or towards the end of his reign, he's not sick, but he's old, and he decides to pass the authority of the kingship on to his daughters. And he stages a contest. He has 3 daughters, Goneril, Regan, and Cordelia. And he proposes to them that he will give the lion's share of his kingdom to the daughter who loves him best. And the first 2 daughters, Goneril and Regan, say they love him more than eyesight, space, and liberty, and they'll do everything in the world for him. They love him more than themselves, more than their husbands, more than their eventual children, more than anything. And meanwhile, Cordelia, who is arguably the most wonderful of the children, the youngest, the shyest, and the most pure, is off in the corner saying, what am I supposed to say? I can't heave my heart into my mouth. Unlike my sisters, I can't lie. She's a person who's bound by her inability to lie and her determination to always speak the truth. And she cannot say what her sisters say. So when her turn comes, she says, I love you as I should as a daughter, no more and no less. I respect you, I love you, you're my father, but I can't say anything else. And Lear can't believe his ears, and he says, nothing will come of nothing, speak again. Can you say anything more? And she says, no. And again he rails, nothing will come of nothing. And this is a theme that persists throughout the play. And finally she can't, and he casts her out. Now she has 2 suitors, her sisters are both married. Goneril is married to Albany, the Duke of Albany, and Regan is married to Cornwall, Duke of Cornwall. And Cordelia is being pursued by the Duke of Burgundy and also the King of France. Burgundy, when Lear says, I'm not going to give you anything, Burgundy says, I'm out of here. I really wanted her, but I also wanted her money and her power, so forget it. And France says, no, there's more to a person than what they have. There's her purity, her goodness, and I want her. So she marries France and goes away, being banished by Lear, and she's no longer his daughter. The plan that Lear has, and this is consistent with contemporary law, is that he will reserve for himself 100 knights and the privilege of going wherever he wants to, whichever daughter he wants to stay with for as long as he wants. This is actually technically legal for him to do at that time, but his daughters have a different idea. The first one that he visits is Goneril. He comes with his 100 knights, and she says, no, you really can't come in with 100 knights. Where am I going to put them all? Take 50. And he says, no, I'm going to go and visit my other daughter, Regan. She'll take the 100 knights. But meanwhile, the 2 daughters have communicated, and the bottom line is by the time he gets to Regan's house, they've decided he can have no knights. He can stay, but he has to sort of do whatever they want him to do. He has no more power.
Alberto, please come to Ms. F's office.
No more retinue that he's allowed to bring with him, and he has to just be subservient to whatever they want him to do. He rails at them. Their husbands are complicit with them. He says that he leaves the house, and they simultaneously banish him. He goes screaming out onto a heath. He's lost in the middle of this heath at one point with no one around him except his fool, and I'll get to that in a minute, and it starts to storm. Now, 2 people have come with him, 2 people from his court. One of them is his fool, and the other is a man named Kent, who's his aide, his best friend, his advisor. And Kent stands up for Cordelia during the contest, and he is banished as well. He disguises himself and follows Lear onto the heath to protect him. it starts to storm, and it becomes the worst storm ever. And here's Lear out in the storm with no one around him, no place to hide to protect himself from the storm. And he's with only two people, the fool and Kent, who's acting foolish, or who's acting simple. The concept of the fool, I'm just stepping back for a second, in Shakespeare, is that the fool's role in a Shakespeare play is to tell the truth. And there are various ways to do it. The fool in Lear is a man, is a real fool. He's brain damaged, and he can only speak in certain ways. He speaks in ways that seem funny sometimes, but actually contain germs of truth. Whatever the fool says is true. He couches it in different language, in funny language or rhyme, but what he says is true, and he's always pointing out to Lear what his foibles are and why he's in the position he's in. That's one level of fool. Another level is a pretend fool, and I'll get to him in a minute. And the third level is someone who also is seen as being foolish, as Kent is, but he disguises himself as a servant, and he follows Lear. And in his hour of need, in Lear's hour of need, Kent comes to him and says, I want to serve you. And Lear looks at him, and at this point he's starting to go crazy, and he says, why? And he says, because you have something in your countenance which I would fain call master. And Lear says, what's that? And he says, authority. So although Lear has been stripped of all his possessions, his retinue, his authority, his responsibility, there's something in him that Kent would still respect. Okay, while all this is going on, a secondary plot is taking place, and it too involves a father and his offspring. Gloucester, the Duke of Gloucester, has two sons. One is a legitimate son, his name is Edgar, and he is a good man. And the other is a villain named Edmund. He is illegitimate, and at one point he cries out, what he's doing is justified because gods must stand up for bastards, and he is a bastard. In Shakespeare, being illegitimate means that you're a bad person. We don't quite see it that way anymore, but at that time, the fact that he was illegitimate is more than just an accident. It implies that his character is also bad. Anyway, Edgar is plotted against by Edmund, the villain, and Edmund, who wants more than his share of Gloucester's fortune, badmouths Edgar and tells Lear that Edgar is going to kill him. So without any proof, Gloucester rails against Edgar, casts him out, and depends entirely on Edmund, who then proceeds to betray him to the bad dukes, Albany and Cornwall, who are now the enemies of Lear. All of these characters, Gloucester, Edgar, and Edmund, meet the characters from Lear's family, Lear and the Fool and Kent on the heath. There's a great big storm. Lear goes crazy. Kent finds them a hovel to hide in, and they all hide in the hovel. Meanwhile, Gloucester has gone back to try to smooth things over with Albany and Cornwall, but because Edmund is determined to kill Gloucester and get all his money, he betrays Gloucester to Cornwall and Albany. Cornwall puts out Gloucester's eyes and pushes him out onto the heath. So blind Gloucester eventually meets up with crazy Lear in the middle of this storm. And if you look at what's going on, it's very symbolic, because in Shakespeare, what nature does reflects what's going on in the human kingdom. So this storm, the storm of the century, the worst storm ever, is encompassing on the heath, which is a big open foresty field or whatever, the two characters that have lost their way. One is mad, one is blind. Meanwhile, Edgar follows his father, Gloucester, to protect him. But he is in such bad, he's not respected by his father anymore, so he has to disguise himself. He disguises himself as poor Tom of Bedlam. Bedlam is an insane asylum. And he takes off all his clothes, he follows his father to protect him, and he acts the part of a madman, and he's the third level of fool in this play, the person who's crazy, even though he's putting it on, he's not really crazy. Okay, the plots intertwine in the heath, and the errors of Lear and Gloucester have resulted in chaos. There is a civil war. The civil war is basically, at first, won by Goneril and her husband Albany, and Regan and her husband Cornwall. But meanwhile, both of these women have been dallying with the villain Edmund. And they're both having affairs, and they become rivals over Edmund's love. Both of them are betraying their husbands. Albany, the husband of Goneril, is catching on to what's going on, and at one point he says, "Goneril, you are not worth the dust which the rude wind blows in your face." So he kind of switches sides, but it's too late because a lot of the damage has already been done. So the Civil War is coming about, and we have the two women, Goneril and Regan, and the vicious son of Gloucester's Edmund, and Cornwall on one side. Albany's stuck in the middle there. He wants to help Lear at this point, but he's powerless to do so. And on the other side are the people on the heath, Lear and Lear and Edgar and Kent and the Fool. France gets wind of this, and he is coming with his troops, with Cordelia, to help Lear and to join Albany and try to make things better. It doesn't quite work, they don't get there on time. The Civil War is lost, and all the major characters die. The two vicious sisters poison each other, and the forces of Goneril and Regan have overcome the forces of France, who comes back later and actually does kind of march in at the end and wins, but it's too late. Gloucester dies in agony on the heath, but after his son Edgar reveals who he is, and they forgive each other. He actually, although he dies happy knowing that at least his son has forgiven him. The tragedy, though, goes on. Everybody else is dying. The two vicious sisters are dying. Cordelia is put in jail. France is too late to save her. She's hung. And Lear, at the end, is left, before his own heart breaks, he's left carrying the body of his one good daughter, and he knows that she's a good daughter now. Everything has been revealed to him by Cordelia, but it's too late. And he dies thinking, not knowing whether she's alive or dead. She's dead, but she's in his arms, and he keeps saying, "Look, she breathes, she breathes." So in some ways, you could argue that he dies thinking that at least Cordelia is alive. You could see that either way. He says she's dead, and then he says, "Look, she breathes. She's dead, she breathes," and then he dies. So at the end, the only people left standing are Edgar, the good son of Gloucester, and Kent, and France. And France comes and kind of puts things back in order with his troops. They offer the kingship to Kent, but he's too old, and he says he's going to follow his master. He's going to die too. And so Edgar becomes the king. He has a lot to put together, but at the end of the play, there is a denouement, there is an unraveling and a restructuring of the kingdom. And there is hope that in the future, the evils and the mistakes that Lear, as well as Gloucester, made won't be made again, that these people can rule in harmony. Edgar's going to rule with the assistance of France as an ally, and that's where the play ends. Okay.
Okay, so let me just, I guess, opening caveat is that I'm not going to talk about how the story of Saul and Samuel and David and Jonathan is a perfect parallel to this, because it's clearly not. But what I want to talk about a little bit is some of the overarching themes in Shakespeare that are very present. So I'm going to start actually with kind of what's the easiest, and that's the idea of the fool and the madman. In the Gemara, it talks about how 1/60th of madness is prophecy. And there's been lots of research. There's a wonderful study that came out of, I think it was Harvard, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, about how the area of the brain that kind of lights up into the deep state of meditation is similar to the area of the brain that is affected in schizophrenia. That, that even on a really neuronal, biological, biochemical level, there's a connection. Thomas Zaz, who was a psychiatrist writing in the 70s and 80s, wrote a book called Ideology and Insanity, how the definition of what even is considered mad as opposed to normal, as opposed to visionary, changes with society. And I explain to my students that much as if you or I were to see somebody walking down the street, either in this really ugly green t-shirt and an even uglier pair of green pants with green ShopRite bags over their shoes and an equally ugly green ShopRite thing on their head, we would immediately understand that this was somebody either running out of surgery or running to surgery. Or, that I think example that a teenager probably would understand best is if they would see me walking down the street like this, and they could only see this side of my face, they would automatically assume there was a little white thing in this ear, that went down into my pocket and I was bopping to an iPod. Whereas if I were doing this 40 years ago and you would see me walking down the street like this, it would either mean that I was high on marijuana or it was time to call the cops and take me to Bellevue, because clearly there's something emotionally wrong with me. So in the book of Samuel, and generally in the book of the prophets, we take for granted that prophecy is normative. But we don't really stop to imagine what prophecy looks like. And what's interesting in the book of Samuel is that there are two scenes in which Saul receives prophecy. One is at the beginning of his kingship, where it is part of the signs that Samuel the prophet gives to Saul, in the sense of, this is how you know that I am not a crazy person and that I am telling you the truth and you really are God's anointed. That you are going to meet up, gives them all these signs and symbols with these three guys, and they're going to have, each one carrying, X, Y, Z. It's amazing how many fairy tale themes. It's like it's the reverse of Bettelheim, right? It's not that fairy tales reflect our internal reality. It's the opposite. It's that the external reality is then reflected in myth later. But you're going to meet up with these guys, and you're going to fall in with them, and then you're going to come to a city where there are a bunch of prophets, and you're going to receive prophecy. And this is exactly what happens, and the Navi describes how Saul, the Spirit of God, rests on Saul, and he is prophesizing with the prophets, and that this actually became an expression is, ooh, Saul is now prophesizing with the prophets, meaning that even a commoner, if he works on himself enough, can become a prophet. What happens to Saul is that when he messes up, and it's only 2 mess-ups, so before we go ahead and vilify Saul, this is what I always say, I wish I only messed up twice in my life. I'd probably mess up twice in an hour. So Saul messes up twice, and this is the other, I think, the most critical difference between a Shakespeare play and a book of the Bible is that, and Enid and I were discussing this, is that in Shakespeare plays, God is noticeably absent. In Tanakh, particularly in the book of Samuel, God is another character, and in many ways is the main character, not so much as a puppeteer, but really as a member of this dynamic. So when Saul messes up twice, in other words, doesn't listen to God, lets the power get to his head, acts impetuously, God goes to Samuel and tells Samuel, we're done here, he's finished. And this is where the professional and the personal come in as between Lear and his daughters. It says, the next verse says, actually at the beginning of the next chapter, it says that God comes to Samuel, and he says, how much longer will you cry and will you mourn for Saul? That the relationship between Samuel and Saul is much, much deeper than teacher and student or prophet and anointed. As a matter of fact, if you go back into the book of Samuel, I think it's chapter 2, if I'm not mistaken. No, chapter 2. The reason that Samuel is named Samuel is not from the word Shema, Shin Mem Aleph, Ayin, right? That God listened to my prayers, but Hannah says, Ki me hashne'it Hashem she'altiv. I requested him from God, and it's completely not coincidental that the name of Shmuel really should have been Shaul. So Samuel sees himself as Saul's father, and Saul sees himself very much as Samuel's son, and when Samuel comes to him and says, we're done, you're fired, God is upset, you blew it, he cries and he mourns and he's like, please don't disgrace me in front of all of Bnei Israel. And it's similar, it brought to mind when Moshe says about Miriam, when she gets tzarat, will a father spit in the face of a child and that child will not be given time to recover from their shame. And so this intertwining of the personal and the professional, and then when Saul loses his spirit of God, what enters into him is what's called an evil spirit. But the evil spirit is also sent by God, and that's madness. Many modern psychologists view Saul as being the perfect example of the bipolar or of the schizoid. He may have been, he may not have been, but it's really clear that his madness is not madness in that it's divorced from reality. It's madness in that he sees reality so clearly. He knows he blew it. He knows what he lost. He knows that David is going to be the future king. He knows that if David becomes king, then Jonathan will obviously not be king, which means that Jonathan is either dead or somehow else gone. He sees all of this clearly. And it literally makes him crazy. He tries to kill David twice. He tries to kill Jonathan once. So we really see how this madness and prophecy and truth and appearance and reality and what's really true and the painfulness of the truth is really very, very terrifying. And the other theme that comes out in Lear, that comes out very clearly in Samuel, is the idea of loyalty, of the true loyalty. And where at first it seems really pathetic and pitiable. We see David's loyalty to Saul. He has two opportunities to murder Saul, and he takes neither one. And not only does he not murder Saul, he doesn't let his band of merry men murder Saul either. And comparable to the quote about I see in your visage something that is master and that is authority, David says to his posse, he says, how dare we murder someone who has been called king of Israel? He has been anointed king. God has made him king through the prophet. He has that literal divine right of king. You can't take that life. We see the loyalty that David and Jonathan have for each other, where Jonathan swears fealty to David, and he says, I know you will be king, and I will be your second. In other words, that purity of love, which I think is similar to the love that Cordelia has for Lear, is that it's like, I don't care. I don't care what this costs me to be pure of heart to you. And in fact, Jonathan is the one, in a way, purest character of the book of Samuel, and he dies pure. He dies in battle. And he dies trying to balance the love he has for his father and the love that he has for David. And then the one other character that we didn't talk so much about, which is more parallel to Lear, and that is the character of Michal, the daughter of Saul, who is the one female character in all of Tanakh who is described as being in love with a man, as opposed to, let's say, Jacob, who's described as being in love with Rachel. And she's caught. She's caught between her father and the man that she loves. And she saves David's life. She helps him escape when Saul is literally after him. She does this whole fake under the cover thing. She blatantly lies to her father and says, the only reason I helped him escape is because he threatened to kill me. She goes through this bizarre and what must have been incredibly painful fake marriage to another man, which is Saul's way of getting back at David. And then when David is gone, he's not only not true to her, he marries 2 other women in the process, and she dies childless. So I would say that Michal is probably only second to Saul in the book as kind of the most tragic. But there's just so much of this kind of parallel themes to Shakespeare, with the one big caveat that ultimately what is right is what is godly. And David is godly, and Saul is not godly, and God's will shall be done. So there's this kind of off-stage character.
Okay. So we're going to just sum up the errors of these 2 books, the main characters in these 2 books, and lessons for our time. The first and most obvious is having a weak plan for succession to the throne. And the plan doesn't work out. And the lesson here is that if you're in authority, you must create order and keep it. The second mistake that these characters make are showing favoritism among their children, not recognizing the goodness or evil in one child versus another, and also pitting them against one another. Having love-hate relationships with them, it turns out in both of these books that one child is the savior and the solace of the father, and the others act as enemies or nothing. The characters also succumb to flattery. When Lear asks Cordelia to speak again, just tell him more good things about himself, and then she'll get her share of the fortune. He's succumbing to flattery there. He succumbed to the flattery of his other 2 daughters. He also succumbed to hatred, anger, and self-pity. He says when he's out on the heath, he's naked in the pouring rain and cold, with nothing to shelter him. And he says, is there any cause in nature that makes these hard hearts? He blames nature for what's going on. And this is, again, one of his other faults. He blames others more than himself. He says, I'm a man more sinned against than sinning. Whereas in contrast, Gloucester, who as soon as his eyes are put out, understands what the whole situation is, and his words are, I have no way and therefore want no eyes. I stumbled when I saw. So contrast these 2. I stumbled when I saw, and I am a man more sinned against than sinning. There are 2 different ways of looking at what happens to you and arguing with the universe, or not arguing. The lesson for us, I think, is that we must learn from our mistakes, take responsibility and authority for our mistakes, and do better in the future. Another problem is seeing justice too late. It takes both Lear and Gloucester too long to understand which of their children is pure and good and loving. And pitting others too late as well. Lear does eventually show pity for the fool, first of all. When he gets to the hovel that Kent has found for him to get out of the rain, he steps back and he says to the fool, you go in first. And the fool, by the way, at this point in the play disappears. In Act 3, the fool says, I'll go to bed at noon. And noon is, if you think of the structure of a Shakespearean play, the middle of the play, noon of the play is Act 3. The fool goes into the hovel and never comes out again. We don't know whether he dies, he ran away, or whatever, but the message is the tragedy is too much for him. In his simple mind, he can't make sense of it anymore. Even though his sense has always been a little bit off, nonetheless, he's always come in with poignant and relevant comments, and he can't do that anymore. It's too much for him. And the tragedy is too much for him, and he disappears. The other mistake that Lear makes, and that also is made in the story of of Saul, and Samuel is dying in despair, though it can be argued that some hope remains at the end. Lear does look at Cordelia and say, she lives, she breathes. And the lesson is that man must endure, persevere, strive for justice and right, and not despair. Keep hope. And Edgar, the good son of Gloucester, echoes that. He says, this is not the worst as long as we can say this is the worst. Then also, I think this is absent from Lear, but it's implied. We must adhere to a religious agenda. The powerful need to remember that they're not, in fact, the final authority. If they forget that they are subservient to God, they're doomed. And this does not come up in Lear, but it's very much implied. He forgets who he is, what he owes to the universe, to God, and he dies for it. And the corollary to that is that we must understand the power of love, love of God, filial loyalty, fraternal loyalty, respect for authority, and most of all, self-respect.
So very similar themes in Samuel, which is the whole idea of having a king, a human king, is one that's greatly debated. There's in the Sefer Devarim, in the book of Deuteronomy, it's actually a debate between the Rambam, the Ramban, and the Abarbanel as to whether anointing a king is a mitzvah, A, is an option, B, and is a last resort and really bad idea, C. And it seems that Samuel definitely subscribes to option C. When the Jews come to him and ask him for a king, he's really mad. And he said, and then God says to him, don't be mad. This isn't about you. I love that one. It's not about you. This is about me. It really is all about me. They're rejecting me. They've been rejecting me for the last 400 and some odd years. This is nothing new. But there's this idea of who is the ultimate king and who is the ultimate authority and what happens when someone gets into a position of power. Can one be in a position of power and authority and leadership and remain humble, which was the apogee that Moshe reached. And basically Saul and David were the two kings who also had prophecy, because after that Solomon was desperate to get prophecy. It only happened once in his life because it was, the Gemara says that God said, this isn't going to work. You can't be a prophet and a king at the same time. You can't have your head in the heavens and your feet in the mud. And it goes back to this idea of Adam Harishon was actually able, that's the idea of his head was in the clouds and his feet were on the ground, that he was able to synthesize these two, and Moshe got pretty close. But any time that the characters in Shmuel forget that God is the ultimate king, they get into trouble. The critical difference between David and Saul, as is the difference in Chumash between Yehuda and Reuven, is that David acknowledges this right away. He, time after time after time, when he makes mistakes and is confronted by a Navi, says, you're right, I'm wrong. Right? With Bathsheba, I sinned. With the counting of the troops, I would rather rely on God's mercy because I sinned against God and I don't want to fall into human hands. And the entire book of Psalms is about David's recognition of God. And this is really the ultimate salvation. And that, again, what happens when petty concerns get in the way of the purer things like love and devotion, love and devotion to what is right, to what is holy, David's devotion to Shaul, Yonatan's devotion to David, Shmuel's devotion to Shaul, it's like, and what happens and what happens when that goes wrong, and the tragedy that comes out, and ultimately what the lesson is for our time. And I think for me that the takeaway from the story of Saul and David is that kingship, a holy king can work, but it can only work with a system of checks and balances. You can't have a divine authority, so to speak, that you need the prophet, you need the best friend telling you you're an idiot, like in Lear. And you need to have the humility to listen to said best friend. But that if you have that fundamental humility, that love and hope and soulfulness does conquer in the end. And it's, David cries for Saul and Jonathan, which is, it's just very poignant.
And Lear simultaneously dies with a little bit of hope, which leads us to one question that we have for you, and you can take this away and ponder it, or you can answer it now, and that is, does power corrupt, and does monarchy ever work? 2 questions. So, does power corrupt? Anyone want to say anything about that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Can it be mitigated though? Is there something as good power, a responsible moral power?
Yeah, if there's a system of checks and balances, if it's shared power. When power is too concentrated in one individual, that's when historically we have problems.
Like a constitutional monarchy.
Or a Sanhedrin.
And then the other question is, and this is a question that we don't talk about, is kingship a good thing? Is it a good system? Is it a system that we should strive for? Does it make life better?
Considering that David and Shaul and Shlomo all had major failings in that position, and we don't think we could ever get to their level,